But it's the question that you've probably got to deal with most in your approach. If you're tasked with setting up SLAs, you're going to get a lot of resistance, a lot of people going, well, what's the point? We've had IT for 30, 40 years. We haven't had SLAs. Why do we need them now? We tried it 3, 4 years ago and it didn't work. And I would then say, right, well, why didn't it work? And here's some of the answers. Generally because it's created by IT departments only, and very often in isolation by actually not engaging with its customers, and that's the first mistake. But very often the way it is actually produced can be a number of these things, and we'll have a look at that in the next slide. But you know, it can be rather patronizing, it can be oversimplified or overcomplicated, with lots of information that's just not relevant or appropriate. Very often it tends to be system focused and rather than service focused. People can spend too much time trying to engineer it to make it exactly right, and I think what we're saying is if you can get 70–80% right on the first few goes, you're doing quite well. But very often the work required is underestimated, particularly around about negotiating and getting agreement with people. It's actually quite simple to draw something up. The difficult bit is getting people to agree it and actually working with it. And if it's not measurable or actionable, and by actionable I mean that actually what you're saying is what you actually can do, there's not much point in doing it. The worst thing though is when actually you might do all those things but you still don't do anything with the information that's produced from it. And one of the real benefits of an SLA is that you can actually map your requirement against your actual delivery and identify what the gaps are. And from that point of view, it's a quality process. But very often they're filed away in a cupboard somewhere and never used. And you know, I've seen lots of SLAs like this where it's all written in small print. Nobody really pays much attention to it. When you actually look at the small print, it can actually be translated into something like this. And this is a bit of fun, but it actually reflects the sorts of things that you get in SLAs, where IT is full of caveats and full of disclaimers that make it look like a legal document. That performance or even targets are not even properly defined, or that they are targeted as percentages of percentages, which seems to be ridiculous. If the target is an hour, then that's the target. Sometimes IT will do things quite autonomously, whether the customer wants it or not. Very often there's information in there that's just completely meaningless and of no relevance or understanding to those that are reading it. And again, that comes across as patronizing. Again, there's that sense of IT being the one that's in control of the situation rather than being the service provider. And there's very often too much focus on availability targets, actually, which are not relevant. And we know that availability is really important, but we need to focus on availability when it's actually required. So that's the sort of thing that we see. Why are SLAs like this? We're going to have another question now, and our question here is, how well defined is your SLA process? Do your SLAs look like the ones that we've just put up there? We're going to look at actually the reasons or the ways that we can actually identify how you can avoid that sort of thing and produce an SLA that looks concise, meaningful, relevant to the organization. Okay, so what do we think are the issues? What do we think are the reasons why SLAs tend to be so poor? And particularly because they are a key. For me, the SLA, the service level management piece, the service definition piece, is the heartbeat of ITIL, really. It's the thing that actually gives ITIL the mandate, and an IT service organization, the mandate to deliver all these processes that we spend so much time talking about. If we haven't got our service definition right, if we're not clear on what the service expectation is, then what are we actually doing? And the SLA should give us a target that we can measure to identify gaps. So the real issues I think we need to look at are that SLAs are often started without services being defined or understood. And back to the first point about service catalogue, have we actually thought about the services before we've started to negotiate SLAs? Sometimes there's that poor person who's given the job who doesn't perhaps understand it, and I'm including in that many people who've got ITIL qualifications. Over the years I've done lots of sessions with service level management practitioners and so on who maybe have not done enough of this to be comfortable. I think you've got to present confidence to the organisation that you know how you want them to act and drive them forward, otherwise they'll just push back. But what happens is that that person very often is being asked to do two things. They're being asked to define the services and the SLAs at the same time. And I think what we want to do is make sure that we separate those things out, particularly if the SLA negotiation is difficult. If we've got a structure to work that in, then that's absolutely great, and it's a much better advantage. If you're trying to define the SLA and the service at the same time, and there's a problem, it makes the whole thing very, very difficult. So there, I think I've carved out a few points to try and help us to understand what we think are the issues with SLAs, and this just finally for me is the what I think SLAs should be looking like. They should be agreements. They should be simple documents that are based on understanding and reflect the fact that there's been agreements. SLA, service level agreement, it should reflect that. It should be a simple document. It shouldn't be filled with jargon or legalese. We're not trying to be lawyers. We don't need to be. We work for the same organisation very often. There should be terms of reference. We shouldn't be trying to SLA everything to death. We'll never be able to do that. So we should be thinking about just normal services first. And most of all, they should be living documents. We should all know, everybody who's involved in the supply chain should one way or another have an exposure and understanding to what the SLA is and how it works. And that doesn't mean to say that they've all read a 70-page document. It may be that they just need to have access to some information through the portal or reporting that makes it clear to them where that is. So that's the sort of background, what an SLA is, how it should be initiated, where we sometimes go wrong with SLAs. I'm now going to pass over to our Service Development Manager, Brian Henry. Just before we do that, question 3 is really about where you might determine your SLAs if you're looking at a new service. It's quite a key question, really, I think, because it comes back to whether or not you're trying to do too many things at the one time. But I'm going to hand over now to Brian and well, ask him these questions. How can we avoid these issues?
Okay, thank you, Barclay. Yes, this part of the presentation is going to look at how we can perhaps avoid some of the issues that Barclay has highlighted in the last few slides. And it's not just about avoiding the issues, I think, so much, but it's also trying to encourage buy-in from IT and from the business. It's very important that we get buy-in from both of these places if we are going to make this work. It's like anything, if people are engaged and involved and bought into the process, then they're going to be much more likely to help and drive it forward in the way we actually need it. So some of the things then that we need to think about to start avoiding these issues is getting everyone across IT and the business together and establishing a partnership between IT and the business. This is something that's been a recurring theme if you'd listened to some of the previous webcasts, where we identify the importance of actually getting IT and the business talking together. If we are going to be defining services and SLAs that IT has to provide and the business requires, then we have no choice, we have no option. We must get IT and the business talking together so they can understand exactly what they need to do. Start with services and the service catalogue is the second point here. And really, without understanding the services the business requires, it's very difficult to actually start to put together meaningful and appropriate SLAs. We need to understand what the service means to the business, and from that, we can then identify how we're going to support that service for the business. Getting the right people involved is another very important thing as well, because we need to make sure that the people who are interested, or a vested interest in this, maybe stakeholders, if you like, are included in the process, so we get all the views. We also need to obviously include people that have an understanding of what the business needs, but also people who have an understanding of the IT capabilities, because it's a combination of those two elements that are going to allow us to put together appropriate and meaningful SLAs. And the last point there maybe talks about a pilot and phased approach. I think some organizations do struggle with SLAs because they perhaps try to introduce everything at once. And that's a big ask. So the recommendation is often just to think about maybe taking a certain set of services and SLAs, or maybe engaging with one particular part of the business initially to allow us to adopt this pilot or phased approach that allows us to introduce it gently into the business and allows us to maybe start to look at identifying and showing some quick wins that we can actually get from this approach. One of the other areas that we always recommend, and we've seen pay dividends in the past really, is looking at education right at the start of the process before we really start to tackle the issue, getting some form of education. And we often recommend some form of workshop, which is a combination of education, which educates people on the concepts and the high-level ideas of service-level management, service catalogs, and service-level agreements, but also through the course of that day helps them to understand what they're going to have to start thinking about, maybe any barriers they have to the implementation of SLAs within their organization. And it starts to give them some practical advice and guidance on how they should actually take forward. Some of the other advantages to this education, of course, as we said earlier, buy-in is very important because, as we said, if people buy into it, if they feel involved, if they feel they're part of the process, they're much more encouraged, much more liable to help and drive and actually make this work. It speeds up the process of introducing service catalogs and SLAs because we've had the education. We can almost hit the ground running now. We know what we're talking about. We know the things we have to think about, so it speeds up the process of implementation. It can also avoid costly delays later in the project. Because we've been through this definition, or the education and definition phase right at the start, we can ensure that nothing's missed. We haven't left things out, we haven't forgotten about things, so that suddenly we don't get to that situation 6 months into the project, say, where suddenly we realize there's a whole number of things we haven't included. It also gets people talking in the same language, and a common terminology, I think, is vitally important. If we're going to be documenting services and SLAs, we need to make sure that everyone understands the words and the contents of those documents. And having that same language will ensure that happens. And again, the last bullet point there talks about establishing that partnership again between IT and the business. Keep coming back to it. It's absolutely critical to the success of service catalogs, to SLAs, to services, and to the operation of IT within the business even, about establishing that partnership and those communication channels. Some other things that we find that the education helps on as well is we start to get this idea within IT of being able to show the costs of providing services. It's something IT has been historically quite poor at. But if we're able to identify services, SLAs, and what it takes to support those services, then we can start to identify the actual costs of providing those services to the business. That also allows us then hopefully to start showing the value that we add to the business as well, rather than just how much it costs. This is what you're getting for that cost. And they can start to see why it costs the money it does. And perhaps some organizations can base the pricing on this. If they want to price or charge their customers based on the services, they have a much better baseline now to actually explain why things cost what